The security camera footage from Jefferson High School showed everything. At 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, 3 figures slipped through a side entrance that should have been locked. By morning, what had been a pristine classroom was transformed into a canvas of destruction. Spray paint covered every surface. Desks were overturned. Windows were cracked. But what the vandals didn't know was that their new target wasn't just any teacher. And what happened next would change everything at Jefferson High forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Jefferson High School as Rebecca Chun pulled her silver Honda Civic into the teacher's parking section. At 28 years old, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from years of discipline and training. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and despite the early hour, her brown eyes held an alertness that spoke of someone accustomed to being ready for anything. Rebecca had spent the last 3 years teaching at Lincoln Academy, a private school in Connecticut, where the biggest classroom disruption was a student forgetting to silence their phone. Jefferson High in Phoenix, Arizona, was going to be different. She knew that. The principal, Dr. Patricia Holloway, had been upfront during the interview process about the challenges facing the school. Budget cuts had led to larger class sizes, and the neighborhood had seen better days. But Rebecca had grown up in similar circumstances, and she believed every student deserved a teacher who wouldn't give up on them. As she walked through the main entrance, Rebecca noticed the worn linoleum floors and the faded motivational posters that hadn't been updated in years. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner mixed with something she couldn't quite identify. Other teachers moved through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to navigate their environment without making waves. "You must be Ms. Chun." The voice belonged to a tall man in his 50s with graying temples and tired eyes. "I'm Frank Garrison, assistant principal. Dr. Holloway asked me to show you to your classroom." They walked through hallways lined with dented lockers, past a trophy case that showcased achievements from decades past. Students were already beginning to filter in for the day, and Rebecca observed their interactions carefully. Groups clustered together based on invisible social hierarchies she was already beginning to decode. The athletes wore their leather jackets despite the Arizona heat. The academic achievers carried worn textbooks and had the slightly hunched posture of students carrying too much weight, both literally and figuratively. And then there were the others, the ones who moved through the halls like they owned them, their eyes constantly scanning for their next target. "Here we are," Frank said, stopping in front of room 237, English and Creative Writing. The previous teacher, Mrs. Martinez, had been here for 15 years before she transferred to a school district in Scottsdale. He didn't need to say why. Mrs. Martinez had left. Rebecca could read between the lines. The classroom was actually in better condition than she had expected. 30 desks arranged in traditional rows faced a whiteboard that had seen better days but was functional. Large windows on the east wall let in natural light, and there was even a small bookshelf in the corner that held a collection of classic literature. Rebecca had brought boxes of her own books, planning to supplement whatever the school could provide. "The custodial staff comes through every evening," Frank continued, "but you'll want to make sure everything is secured before you leave. We've had some incidents with vandalism in the past." Rebecca nodded, making a mental note. She had dealt with difficult students before, but something in Frank's tone suggested the challenges at Jefferson High went beyond typical teenage rebellion. As Frank left her to get settled, Rebecca began arranging her classroom. She had always believed that environment mattered. Students who felt respected in their learning space were more likely to respect themselves and others. She moved the desks from rigid rows into a more collaborative U-shaped configuration. On one wall, She hung posters featuring diverse authors and their quotes about the power of storytelling. Maya Angelou's words took center stage. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. Around 10 o'clock, as she was organizing her desk drawers, the door opened without a knock. 3 students entered with the casual confidence of people who were accustomed to going wherever they pleased. The leader was a stocky boy with bleached hair and the kind of smirk that suggested he found most things amusing, especially things that weren't supposed to be funny. His followers flanked him, one tall and lanky with nervous energy, the other shorter but built like he spent serious time in the weight room. "You the new teacher?" the bleached-haired boy asked, though it was clearly rhetorical. He didn't wait for an answer before continuing. "I'm Tyler Brennan. This is Jake Morrison and Carlos Vega." He gestured casually to his companions. "We like to welcome new teachers personally." Rebecca straightened to her full height, which was admittedly not intimidating at 5 feet 4 inches, but her posture conveyed something that made Tyler's smirk falter slightly. "I'm Miss Chun, and I appreciate students who take initiative to introduce themselves properly." Her voice was calm but carried an undertone that suggested she wasn't easily impressed by swagger. Tyler's smirk returned. "See, the thing is, Miss Chun, Jefferson High has its own way of doing things. The last teacher, Mrs. Martinez, she figured that out eventually, made things easier for everyone." "I'm sure Mrs. Martinez was a fine teacher," Rebecca replied evenly. "But I'm not Mrs. Martinez," Jake Morrison, the tall one, snickered. "No, you definitely ain't." She was smart enough to know when to look the other way. Rebecca moved around her desk, eliminating the barrier between herself and the 3 students. It was a subtle shift, but one that changed the dynamic of the room. Instead of being behind a position of authority, she was now standing in open space, balanced on the balls of her feet in a way that might have seemed casual to someone who didn't know what to look for. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice maintaining its calm tone, "I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume you're here because you're genuinely interested in English and creative writing. In which case, I'd be happy to discuss the curriculum with you during appropriate hours. However, if you're here for some other reason, I suggest you rethink your approach." Carlos Vega, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. He was the type who clearly did his talking with physical presence rather than words. "You don't seem to understand how things work around here, lady. Maybe you need some time to think about it." The threat was unmistakable, though carefully worded to avoid anything that could be directly reported to administration. Rebecca had heard variations of it before, but never delivered with quite this level of casual menace. "I understand perfectly," Rebecca said. "What I think you gentlemen don't understand is that I'm not intimidated by empty threats from teenagers who think they're more important than they actually are." The silence that followed was electric. Tyler's face flushed red, and Jake's nervous energy transformed into something more focused and potentially dangerous. Carlos's hands clenched into fists. "You're going to regret that attitude," Tyler said. Quietly, ask anyone. Teachers who don't show proper respect around here have a hard time. "Respect is earned," Rebecca replied, "not demanded through intimidation." After a long moment, Tyler jerked his head toward the door, and the 3 of them filed out. But not before Tyler turned back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome to Jefferson High, Miss Chun. Hope you last longer than you think you will." As their footsteps faded down the hallway, Rebecca remained standing in the same spot, her breathing steady and controlled. She had expected challenges at her new school, but the encounter had confirmed that the problems at Jefferson High were more serious than typical adolescent testing of boundaries. These weren't just kids acting out. They were students who had learned that intimidation worked, and they had clearly driven away at least one teacher before her. Rebecca walked to her desk and pulled out her phone, scrolling to a contact she hadn't called in months. The name read Master Kim's Academy. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Kim's Academy. This is Jennifer speaking. Hi Jennifer, this is Rebecca Chun. Is Master Kim available? I'd like to resume my training. Schedule. As she made arrangements for evening classes, Rebecca looked around her newly organized classroom. She had worked too hard to get here to be driven away by a few bullies, no matter how practiced they were at their intimidation tactics. What Tyler and his friends didn't know was that Rebecca had spent years learning how to stand her ground against people much more dangerous than high school students. And if they thought they could break her spirit with threats and games, they were about to learn something new about their new English teacher. The morning sun continued to stream through the classroom windows, illuminating the Maya Angelou quote on the wall. There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. Rebecca had a feeling that before this school year was over, a lot of untold stories were going to come to light. The first week at Jefferson High revealed the complex social architecture that Tyler and his crew had built over years of unchallenged dominance. Rebecca observed it all with the analytical mind of someone trained to read situations quickly and accurately. During her second period advanced English class, she noticed how other students' behavior shifted whenever Tyler, Jake, or Carlos walked past the classroom windows. Conversations would stop mid-sentence. Eyes would dart nervously toward the door. Even students who weren't direct targets had learned to make themselves invisible when the trio was nearby. Samantha Rodriguez was one of Rebecca's brightest students, a junior with sharp insights about literature and a natural talent for creative writing. But whenever footsteps echoed in the hallway, Samantha would shrink into her seat and pull her long black hair forward to hide her face. During a discussion about courage in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, Samantha had made a brilliant connection between Atticus Finch's moral stand and modern-day whistleblowers, but her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper when she heard Tyler's distinctive laugh from the corridor. Samantha, Rebecca said gently after class, I'd like you to consider entering the regional writing competition. Your essay on social justice themes was exceptional. Samantha's eyes lit up for a moment before fear crept back in. I don't know, Ms. Chun. It's a lot of attention, and I prefer to keep a low profile. Sometimes the stories that need to be told, most are the ones we're most afraid to share, Rebecca replied, but she didn't push. She was beginning to understand that fear. At Jefferson High was a survival mechanism, not a character flaw. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The teaching staff had their own complex relationship with the school's bullying problem. During lunch in the faculty room, Rebecca listened to conversations that revealed just how deeply the issue had penetrated the school's culture. The key is documentation, said Helen Crafts, a math teacher who had been at Jefferson for over a decade. Everything in writing, everything reported, but don't expect miracles. The Brennan family has connections with the school board. David Park, who taught chemistry, shook his head while grading papers. I had Tyler in my class last semester. Kid's not stupid, just entitled. When he actually showed up and did the work, he pulled decent grades. Problem is, he figured out early that intimidation gets him what he wants with less effort. What happened to Mrs. Martinez? Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew. The faculty room went quiet for a moment before Helen answered. Started with small things. Her car got keyed in the parking lot. Classroom supplies going missing. Then someone broke into her classroom and destroyed a semester's worth of student projects the night before parent conferences. Was there proof it was Tyler's group? Rebecca asked. Of course not, David replied. They're too smart for that. But everyone knew. The final straw was when someone spray-painted profanity across her whiteboard and left ... unpleasant items on her desk. Administration promised an investigation, but nothing came of it. Dr. Patricia Holloway, the principal, was caught in an impossible position. Rebecca had requested a meeting to discuss classroom security and had found a woman who genuinely cared about her students, but was fighting battles on multiple fronts. I inherited this situation when I took over 3 years ago, Dr. Holloway explained from behind a desk covered with incident reports and budget documents. The previous administration let certain behaviors slide for too long. By the time I arrived, patterns were established. She pulled out a thick folder labeled Student Discipline. Brennan, Tyler. 43 documented incidents since freshman year. Verbal intimidation, destruction of property, disruption of classes. But everything falls just short of expulsion-worthy offenses. His family's lawyer is very good at making sure of that. What about the other students, Morrison and Vega? Followers, Dr. Holloway said with obvious frustration. Without Tyler, they're manageable. With him, they become part of something bigger and more destructive. Rebecca studied the reports, noting patterns in the timing and targets. They're strategic about this. Absolutely. They know exactly how far they can push without crossing lines that would result in serious consequences. And they've created an atmosphere where other students are too scared to provide testimony when incidents occur. That afternoon, Rebecca decided to stay late to prepare lesson plans for the following week. The building emptied out quickly after the final bell, leaving only the sounds of custodial staff moving through distant hallways and the occasional slam of a locker door. Around 6 o'clock, as she was organizing handouts for her freshman composition class, she heard voices in the hallway. They were trying to be quiet, but teenage boys weren't naturally suited for stealth operations. Security cameras busted on this end. Jake's voice carried through the door. Been that way for months. Perfect, Tyler replied. Carlos, you brought the stuff? Rebecca moved silently to her classroom door and positioned herself where she could see through the narrow window. Tyler was directing his friends like a general commanding troops. Carlos carried a backpack that clinked metallically when he set it down. Remember, Tyler said, we want her to get the message, but nothing that can be traced back to us. Make it look random. They were 3 doors down from her classroom, standing in front of room 231, her storage room where she kept extra supplies and the books she'd brought from her previous school. Rebecca faced a choice. She could call security, but the campus security guard was a part-time employee who had probably already left for the day. She could call the police, but by the time they arrived, the damage would be done and Tyler's group would be long gone. Or she could handle this herself. She thought about Samantha Rodriguez, shrinking into her seat every time Tyler walked by. She thought about Mrs. Martinez, driven away from a job she'd held for 15 years. She thought about all the other teachers who had learned to look the other way rather than face Tyler's brand of harassment. Rebecca pulled out her phone and opened the camera app, setting it to record. Then she stepped into the hallway. Interesting evening activity, gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the empty corridor. All 3 boys spun around. Tyler's face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, anger, and then calculation. Miss Chun, what are you still doing here so late? His tone was artificially friendly, but his body language was tense. We were just looking for the janitor. Though we saw someone suspicious in the building. How civic-minded of you, Rebecca replied, walking closer. And I suppose that backpack contains neighborhood watch supplies? Carlos instinctively moved to block her view of the bag, but not before she caught a glimpse of spray paint cans and what looked like a crowbar. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Jake said, his nervous energy now manifesting as visible. Fidgeting. We should probably get going. Parents are expecting us home for dinner. Excellent idea, Rebecca agreed. In fact, I think we should all head to the main office together. I'm sure Principal Holloway would be very interested in your volunteer security patrol. Tyler's artificial friendliness evaporated. Or you could mind your own business, and pretend you didn't see anything, like a smart teacher would. The threat was clear, but Rebecca had heard worse from people far more dangerous than a teenage bully. During her college years, she had trained at a gym in a rough part of Hartford where intimidation was a daily occurrence. She had learned early that bullies, regardless of age, operated on the assumption that their targets would back down. "Here's what's going to happen," Rebecca said, her voice remaining calm. "You're going to pick up that backpack, walk straight to the exit, and go home. And you're going to forget whatever plan you had for this evening." "Or what?" Carlos asked, stepping forward. He was clearly the muscle of the group, and his size advantage was obvious. Rebecca didn't back up. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, a movement so subtle that none of the boys noticed it, but one that put her in a more balanced stance. "Or I call the police, show them the video I've been recording since you started talking, and let them search that backpack." I'm guessing the contents would be very difficult to explain. Tyler's eyes darted to her phone, which was indeed pointed in their direction, with the record light visible. "You can't record us without permission," Jake said, though he didn't sound confident about the legal principle he was citing. "Actually, in a public school building where I have legitimate business being present, I can record anything I observe. It's called evidence documentation." The standoff lasted for nearly 30 seconds. Tyler was clearly calculating odds and options, weighing his usual intimidation tactics against this unexpected resistance. Finally, he jerked his head toward the exit. "This isn't over," he said to Rebecca. "No," she replied evenly. "I don't suppose it is." As the three boys walked away, Rebecca noticed that Carlos left the backpack behind in their haste to leave. After their footsteps faded completely, she used a pencil to carefully open it. 3 cans of black spray paint, a crowbar, and a package of permanent markers that could have done serious damage to her classroom and supplies. That evening, Rebecca sat in her apartment reviewing the day's events. She had prevented one incident, but Tyler's parting words made it clear that this was escalation, not resolution. She looked at her phone, where Master Kim's academy was still listed in her recent contacts. Tomorrow, she decided she would definitely resume her training schedule. Tyler Brennan and his friends had no idea what they had just started, but Rebecca was beginning to understand that conventional approaches weren't going to solve Jefferson High's bullying problem. Sometimes, the most effective teachers were the ones who could handle themselves when the textbooks and lesson plans weren't enough. Master Kim's academy occupied a converted warehouse on the industrial side of Phoenix, far from the polished fitness centers that catered to suburban clientele. The building's exterior was unremarkable, weathered concrete and small windows that revealed nothing of what lay inside. But the moment Rebecca pushed through the heavy glass doors, the familiar sounds and smells transported her back to a time when her biggest concerns were perfecting her form and advancing to the next belt level. The rhythmic impact of gloves against heavy bags echoed through the main training floor. Fighters of all skill levels moved through their routines with the focused intensity that only came from years of disciplined practice. In one corner, a group of beginners worked on basic stance and footwork under the guidance of a senior student. Across the room, advanced practitioners sparred with controlled aggression that demonstrated both power and precision. Master Kim himself was exactly as Rebecca remembered, a compact man in his 60s, whose unassuming appearance masked decades of competitive fighting experience. His gray hair was pulled back in a short ponytail, and his movements carried the fluid efficiency of someone who had long ago eliminated all unnecessary motion from his technique. "Rebecca Chun," he said without looking up from the student he was correcting. "It has been 8 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days since your last class." She wasn't surprised that he remembered exactly. Master Kim had an uncanny ability to track the details of every student's journey, regardless of how long they'd been away. "I know I should have called sooner," Rebecca began, but he cut her off with a subtle hand gesture. Excuses are for people who make the same mistake twice. You are here now, that is what matters. He dismissed his current student with a few words of encouragement in Korean before turning his full attention to Rebecca. His dark eyes studied her with the kind of assessment that went beyond physical conditioning to evaluate mental state and motivation. You carry tension in your shoulders, he observed. And your stance favors your left side more than before. You have been under stress. New job, Rebecca explained. New challenges. Ah, and these challenges require more than classroom. Management skills? Master Kim had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to read between the lines. During her previous years of training, he had guided her through not just martial arts techniques, but also the mental disciplines that made those techniques effective. There are some students who seem to think intimidation is more important than education, Rebecca said carefully. Master Kim nodded as if this explanation contained all the details he needed. Then we will prepare you for both teaching and learning opportunities. But first, we see what you remember. The next hour was both humbling and encouraging. Rebecca's muscle memory retained more than she had expected. Her basic stance was solid. Her balance was good, and her flexibility hadn't deteriorated significantly. But her timing was off. Her combinations lacked the smooth flow she had once achieved, and her conditioning was obviously not what it had been during her competitive years. Your foundation is strong, Master Kim said as she worked through a series of kick combinations on the heavy bag. But you have been thinking too much and feeling too little. Fighting is not mathematics, it is music. As she trained, Rebecca became aware of another student working out nearby. Angela Torres was a woman in her early 30s who moved with the controlled power of someone who had seen real conflict outside the controlled environment of a training gym. Her technique was practical rather than pretty, and her focus was absolute. During a water break, Angela approached her with the easy camaraderie that developed between serious martial artists. You're getting back into it after some time away? Angela asked, toweling sweat from her face. 8 months, Rebecca replied, starting to feel like 8 years. I know the feeling. I had to take 2 years off when my daughter was born. Thought I'd never get back to where I was. As they talked, Rebecca learned that Angela worked as a security supervisor at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, a job that occasionally required her to deal with aggressive individuals who mistook her 5'6" frame for weakness. The thing about bullies, Angela said, settling into a stretching routine, is that they're usually operating from fear. They're afraid of losing control, afraid of being seen as weak, afraid of facing consequences, but fear makes them predictable. What do? You mean? They have patterns. They escalate in predictable ways. And when you don't react the way they expect, they get confused and make mistakes. Rebecca thought about Tyler's group and their carefully calculated approach to intimidation. What if they're not just operating from fear? What if they actually enjoy causing problems? Angela's expression grew more serious. Then you're dealing with something more dangerous. But the principles are the same. You have to be willing to stand your ground, and you have to be prepared for them to test how far you'll go. Master Kim had been listening to their conversation while supervising other students. Now he joined them with the quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. In Korea, he said, we have a saying, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, but sometimes the nail is strong enough that the hammer breaks first. That evening, Rebecca returned to her apartment with muscles that ached pleasantly from the workout. But more than physical conditioning, she felt a return of something she hadn't realized she'd been missing: confidence in her ability to handle herself in difficult situations. The next morning at Jefferson High, she noticed immediate changes in how she moved through the building. Her posture was straighter, her awareness was heightened, and her responses to the subtle intimidation that permeated the school's atmosphere were different. During third period, Tyler made one of his characteristic, unannounced visits to her classroom. This time, he came alone, which suggested a different kind of strategic thinking. "Miss Chun," he said, sliding into a desk in the front row while her students worked out a writing assignment. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, have you?" Rebecca replied, continuing to circulate among her students and check their progress. She didn't stop to focus on Tyler, which forced him to continue talking to her back. "I realized we might have gotten off on the wrong foot. Maybe we should start over." "That's very mature of you, Tyler." "I mean, we're all part of the Jefferson High community. We should be working together, not against each other." Rebecca paused her circulation and turned to face him directly. Her stance was relaxed but balanced, and her eye contact was steady. "Without being challenging, I agree completely. Education works best when everyone involved is committed to the same goals." Tyler's smile was practiced, but Rebecca could see the calculation behind it. He was probing for weakness, looking for signs that his implied threats from the previous encounter had achieved their intended effect. "So maybe we could arrange a meeting. You know, to clear the air, discuss how things work around here." "Office hours are posted on my door," Rebecca replied. "I'm always available to discuss academic concerns with students during appropriate times. I was thinking of something more informal. After school, maybe, somewhere we could really talk." The suggestion carried obvious implications. Tyler was essentially proposing to isolate her from potential witnesses and support systems, a classic intimidation tactic. "Tyler," Rebecca said, her voice remaining pleasant, but carrying a subtle edge that made several students look up from their work. "I appreciate your interest in improving our working relationship, but I think our current classroom dynamic is exactly where it should be." For a moment, Tyler's mask slipped and she saw frustration flash across his face. He wasn't accustomed to people who didn't respond to his manipulations, according to script. "Of course," he said, the artificial smile returning. "Just thought I'd offer." As he left the classroom, Rebecca noticed that several students who had been watching the interaction with obvious anxiety began to relax. Samantha Rodriguez caught her eye and gave her the smallest nod of approval. That afternoon, Rebecca stayed after school again, but this time she wasn't alone. Dr. Holloway had arranged for additional security presence in the building during evening hours, and the custodial staff had been instructed to work in pairs when possible. As she prepared lessons for the following day, Rebecca reflected on the changes she could already feel occurring. Her morning training session had reminded her of capabilities she possessed beyond traditional teaching tools. Her interaction with Tyler had demonstrated that his tactics were less effective against someone who refused to be intimidated, but she also understood that this was still early in what would likely be a prolonged conflict. Tyler and his friends had years of experience in psychological warfare against teachers and students. They wouldn't give up their established power structure without a fight. Rebecca pulled out her lesson planner and began sketching ideas for a new unit on courage in literature. She wanted to introduce her students to stories about people who stood up against seemingly impossible odds, characters who found strength they didn't know they possessed when circumstances demanded it. As she worked, she could hear the sounds of the custodial staff moving through the building, and occasionally footsteps in the hallway as other teachers finished their own after-hours work. The building felt different than it had just a few days ago, still challenging, but no longer hostile in the same way. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin implementing some new classroom policies that would make it harder for Tyler to use his intimidation tactics. And tomorrow evening, she will be back at Master Kim's academy, continuing to rebuild skills she might very well need. The first major escalation came on a Thursday morning during Rebecca's planning period. She was reviewing student essays when Samantha Rodriguez appeared in her doorway, visibly shaken and clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Miss Chun," Samantha's voice trembled as she stepped into the classroom. I need to show you something. Rebecca immediately set aside her work and guided Samantha to a desk near the window, away from the hallway where passing students might overhear their conversation. Take your time, Rebecca said gently. What's going on? Samantha smoothed out the paper with hands that weren't quite steady. It was a printout of an essay she had submitted for Rebecca's creative writing assignment, a powerful piece about standing up to injustice that had earned an A+ in Rebecca's enthusiastic comments about entering it in the regional competition, but someone had defaced the essay with red ink. Crude drawings covered her carefully crafted paragraphs, and profanity was scrawled across her thesis statement. At the bottom, in block letters, someone had written, "Snitches get stitches. Where did you find this?" Rebecca asked, though she already suspected the answer. Taped to my locker this morning. Everyone walking by could see it. Samantha's voice broke slightly. Miss Chun, I never said anything to anyone about Tyler or his friends. I swear I didn't. Rebecca studied the defaced essay, noting the deliberate nature of the vandalism. This wasn't random teenage cruelty. It was a targeted message designed to silence a student who had dared to write about courage and standing up to bullies. Samantha, this has nothing to do with anything you said or didn't say. This is about intimidating you because your writing has power, and power makes some people nervous. But what if they come after me next? What if they won't? Rebecca said with quiet certainty. I won't let that happen. As Samantha left for her next class, Rebecca photographed the defaced essay and added it to a growing file of documentation. But she also made a decision that went beyond administrative procedures. During lunch, she sought out Marcus Washington, a senior who served as student body president and had a reputation for integrity. Marcus was one of the few students at Jefferson High who moved through the hallways without constantly checking over his shoulder. Miss Chun, Marcus said when she approached his table in the cafeteria. Everything okay? I need to ask you something. And I want you to know there's no pressure to answer if you're not comfortable. Marcus set down his sandwich and gave her his full attention. Around them, the cafeteria buzzed with typical teenage conversations. But Rebecca noticed how many students instinctively lowered their voices when Tyler's group entered the lunch line. How long has Tyler Brennan been running things the way he does? Rebecca asked. Marcus's expression grew serious. You mean the intimidation stuff? Since sophomore year, really. Maybe earlier, but that's when it got organized. Organized how? He figured out the system. How to push right up to the line without crossing it. How to make people scared without doing anything that would get him expelled. And he's smart about recruiting followers. Always picks kids who are insecure or angry about something. Rebecca watched Tyler across the cafeteria. He was holding court at a corner table, with Jake and Carlos flanking him and several other students hanging on his every word. His body language radiated confidence and control. What about the teachers? Has anyone ever really stood up to him? Marcus hesitated before answering. Mrs. Martinez tried, especially after Tyler started targeting some of the younger kids. But then weird stuff started happening to her. Her car getting vandalized, her classroom supplies going missing, anonymous complaints being filed against her with administration. Anonymous complaints about what? Favoritism, unfair grading, being too strict. Nothing that was true, but enough to make her life difficult. And Tyler's mom knows people on the school board, so... Marcus shrugged helplessly. That afternoon, Rebecca's 6th period class provided another example of Tyler's systematic approach to control. She was leading a discussion about conflict resolution in literature when Tyler and Jake appeared in her doorway. They didn't enter the classroom, just stood there with obvious intent to disrupt. Sorry to interrupt, Tyler called out with exaggerated politeness. Just wanted to let everyone know there's a really interesting conversation happening in the hallway. Several students immediately turned their attention away from Rebecca's lesson. Jake held up his phone, apparently playing a video that was generating laughter from students near the door. Rebecca faced a choice. She could ignore the disruption and try to continue her lesson, essentially ceding control of her classroom. She could ask them to leave, which would likely result in more disruption as they slowly compiled while making snide comments. Or she could address it directly. "Tyler, Jake," she said pleasantly, "since you're so interested in our discussion about conflict resolution, why don't you join us? We're analyzing how different characters choose to handle confrontation." The invitation caught Tyler off guard. He had expected her to either ignore him or ask him to leave, both responses that would have allowed him to continue disrupting while maintaining plausible deniability. "Actually," Tyler said, recovering quickly, "we have somewhere else to be." "Of course you do," Rebecca replied. "But the invitation stands anytime you'd like to contribute meaningfully to class discussion." As they walked away, Rebecca noticed that her students seemed surprised by the interaction. They had expected her to back down or become flustered, just as other teachers had learned to do. "Miss Chun," asked David Kim, a quiet junior who rarely spoke in class, "weren't you worried about making them mad?" "David, the moment we start making educational decisions based on fear of how certain students might react, we've stopped being teachers and become hostages." That evening at Master Kim's academy, Rebecca worked through her frustrations on the wall heavy bag with renewed intensity. Her combinations were becoming more fluid, her power was increasing, and her endurance was noticeably improved from just a week of resumed training. "Your technique is returning," Master Kim observed as she finished. "A particularly demanding series of kicks, but your mind is still carrying too much weight." "I'm dealing with some complicated situations at work," Rebecca explained between heavy breaths. "Complicated how? Are you in physical danger?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "Not directly, but I'm dealing with people who use intimidation as a primary tool, and I'm not sure how far they're willing to escalate things." Master Kim nodded thoughtfully. "In competition, we know the rules. In real conflict, there are no rules except the ones you decide to follow. The question becomes, what are you willing to do to protect yourself and others?" Angela Torres, who had been working on pad drills nearby, joined their conversation during the break. "I've been thinking about what you mentioned the other day," Angela said, "about dealing with bullies who enjoy causing problems. I had a situation at work last month that might be relevant." She described an incident where a passenger had become increasingly aggressive and threatening toward airport staff, escalating from verbal abuse to physical intimidation. Traditional de-escalation techniques had failed because the individual wasn't interested in resolution. He was feeding off the fear and discomfort he was creating. "What stopped it," Angela explained, "was when I made it clear that his behavior had consequences he couldn't control. He was used to people either backing down or getting emotional. When neither of those things happened, he didn't know how to respond." "What kind of consequences?" Rebecca asked. "Legal ones, in that case, but the principle applies anywhere. Bullies operate under the assumption that their targets won't fight back effectively. When that assumption proves wrong, their whole strategy falls apart." As Rebecca drove home that night, she reflected on the day's events. Samantha's defaced essay, Tyler's classroom disruption, her conversation with Marcus, all of it pointed to a systematic campaign designed to establish and maintain control through fear. But Rebecca was beginning to understand that Tyler had made a crucial miscalculation. He had assumed she would respond like his previous targets, that she would either retreat or react emotionally in ways that he could exploit. Instead, she was becoming stronger and more strategic with each confrontation. Next morning, Rebecca arrived at school with a new lesson plan and a clear sense of purpose. She had decided it was time to do more than simply resist Tyler's intimidation tactics. It was time to actively teach her students, all of her students, what real strength looked like. As she unlocked her classroom door, she noticed something Different. During the night, someone had attempted to damage the lock mechanism, leaving scratches around the keyhole and metal shavings on the floor. It was subtle enough that most people would miss it, but obvious enough that she would notice. Rebecca smiled as she photographed the evidence. Tyler was escalating, which meant she was having an impact. And if he wanted to turn this into a more serious contest of wills, she was ready to show him exactly what he was up against. The weekend passed quietly, but Rebecca spent it preparing for what she sensed would be a decisive week. She organized all her documentation into a comprehensive file, backed up her phone recordings to cloud storage, and practiced scenarios at Master Kim's Academy with increasing intensity. Angela Torres had introduced her to some practical self-defense techniques that were specifically designed for confined spaces, like classrooms and hallways. Monday morning brought an unexpected development. Dr. Holloway called Rebecca to her office before the first period, and the principal's expression was troubled. "We have a situation," Dr. Holloway said, gesturing for Rebecca to take a seat across from her desk. "Over the weekend, I received a formal complaint about your teaching methods." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten, but kept her voice steady. "What kind of complaint?" "It alleges that you've been showing favoritism to certain students, creating a hostile environment for others, and using intimidation tactics in your classroom management." Dr. Holloway pulled out a typed letter. It's signed by 3 parents, including Mrs. Eleanor Brennan, Tyler's mother. Rebecca should have seen this coming. The complaint specifically mentions that you've been targeting their sons unfairly, making them feel unwelcome in your classroom, and creating an atmosphere of fear and anxiety that's affecting their academic performance. Rebecca almost laughed at the irony. "Dr. Holloway, you've seen my documentation of the actual intimidation that's been happening. Tyler and his friends have been systematically—" "I know," Dr. Holloway interrupted quietly. "And I believe you. But Mrs. Brennan has significant influence with the school board, and she's demanding a formal investigation into your conduct. What does that mean for me?" "It means we need to be very careful about how we proceed. Any direct confrontation with Tyler or his group right now could be twisted to support their narrative. They're essentially trying to flip the script, make you the aggressor and them the victims." Rebecca felt a surge of frustration. Tyler was using the system itself as a weapon, manipulating administrative procedures to protect himself while attacking her credibility. "So what do you recommend?" "Document everything, avoid any situations that could be misinterpreted, and be prepared for increased scrutiny. Unfortunately, that also means being extra cautious about how you handle discipline issues in your classroom." As Rebecca walked to her first period class, she realized Tyler had made a brilliant strategic move. By filing formal complaints, he had essentially handcuffed her ability to respond to his provocations. Any action she took now would be viewed through the lens of an ongoing investigation. But Tyler had also made a mistake. He had assumed that bureaucratic pressure would make her retreat, just as it had with other teachers. What he didn't understand was that Rebecca had spent years training in environments where pressure was designed to reveal character, not break it. Her second period, advanced English class, provided the first test of this new dynamic. Tyler arrived 5 minutes late, making the show of apologizing loudly enough to disrupt the lesson in progress. "Sorry, Ms. Chun," he announced to the entire class. "I was meeting with the guidance counselor about some concerns." The implication was clear. He wanted everyone to know that he had been discussing concerns about her with school officials. Several students exchanged glances, clearly picking up on the subtext. Rebecca didn't take the bait. Instead, she simply handed him the day's assignment and continued her lesson on character motivation in literature. "Today we're analyzing how characters respond when they face opposition," she said, making eye contact with each student. "Some characters retreat, some become aggressive, and some find creative solutions that their opponents don't expect." As the class progressed, Tyler made several attempts to disrupt the flow. He dropped his textbook loudly, made exaggerated sighs during quiet reading time, and asked irrelevant questions designed to derail discussion. But Rebecca had learned from Master Kim that the best defense against distraction was absolute focus. On purpose, she ignored the disruptions and continued teaching, while making careful mental notes of each incident. By the end of class, Tyler looked frustrated by his inability to provoke a reaction. During lunch, Marcus Washington approached Rebecca with concerning news. "Miss Chun, I thought you should know. Tyler's been recruiting," Marcus said quietly as they stood near the library entrance. "He's been talking to some of the younger students, telling them you're going to get fired and they should be careful about being associated with you." "What kind of things is he telling them?" "That you're unstable, that you've been targeting students unfairly, that parents are complaining about you. He's especially going after kids who've been participating in your class discussions." Rebecca felt a surge of anger. It was one thing for Tyler to target her directly, but involving vulnerable students crossed a line. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "Some of the kids are scared. Samantha Rodriguez hasn't been in school since Thursday. Word is her. Parents are considering transferring her to another school." That afternoon, Rebecca made a decision that went against Dr. Holloway's advice about avoiding confrontation. She waited until after school hours and then walked to the gym, where Tyler and his friends often hung out during basketball practice. She found them exactly where she expected, sitting in the bleachers holding court with a group of underclassmen, who hung on their every word. Tyler was in the middle of what appeared to be an animated story when he noticed her approaching. "Miss Chun," he called out with exaggerated enthusiasm. "What brings you to our side of the school?" Rebecca climbed the bleachers until she was at their level, noting how the younger students immediately became nervous in her presence. Tyler had clearly been conditioning them to see her as a threat. "I wanted to discuss your academic progress with you privately," she said calmly. "Unless you'd prefer to have this conversation in front of your friends." It was a calculated move. Tyler couldn't refuse without looking weak, but accepting meant leaving his position of power among the group. "Actually," Tyler said, his smile becoming more predatory, "I think my friends might be interested in hearing about my academic progress. We're all very concerned about fair treatment in your class." "Fair treatment," Rebecca repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. Let's talk about that." She pulled out her phone and opened her grade book app. "Tyler, your current grade in my class is a C-. That's based on 2 missing assignments, 1 plagiarized essay that received a 0, and consistently disruptive behavior that affects your participation grade." Tyler's confident expression faltered slightly. He clearly hadn't expected her to have specific academic ammunition. "Now," Rebecca continued, "if you'd like to discuss ways to improve your grade through legitimate academic effort, I'm happy to help. But if you continue to focus more energy on creating problems than solving them, your grade will reflect that choice." "You can't just fail me because you don't like me," Tyler said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're absolutely right. I can't and won't fail you because of personal feelings, but I will give you the grade your work earns. The choice is entirely yours." As Rebecca walked away, she heard Tyler trying to regain control of the narrative with his audience, but his voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there before. That evening at Master Kim's academy, Rebecca worked through her combinations with a new level of precision and power. Her training had progressed to the point where she was sparring with advanced students, and her confidence was evident in every movement. "You are ready," Master Kim said after watching her spar with Angela Torres. "Your technique has returned, your conditioning is strong, and your mind is clear." "Ready for what?" Rebecca asked, though she suspected she already knew. "For whatever comes next. But remember, the goal is never to cause harm. The goal is to end conflict in a way that protects everyone involved." Angela wiped sweat from her face and nodded in agreement. The most powerful weapon you have is the confidence to stand your ground. Most bullies have never faced someone who refuses to be intimidated. They don't know how to respond. As Rebecca drove home that night, she reflected on the day's events. Tyler's formal complaints had been designed to neutralize her, but instead, they had clarified the situation. This was no longer about simple classroom management or teenage rebellion. This was about someone who had built a system of control through fear and manipulation, and who would escalate to whatever level necessary to maintain that control. But Rebecca was no longer the same person who had walked into Jefferson High 3 weeks ago. She had reconnected with skills and confidence that Tyler couldn't account for in his calculations, and she had begun to understand that sometimes the most important lessons happened outside the official curriculum. The next morning, Rebecca arrived at school to find her classroom door standing open. As she approached, she could see that someone had been inside during the night. Her desk had been searched, papers were scattered across the floor, and someone had written a message on her whiteboard in red marker. "Last warning," Rebecca stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the scene. Then she pulled out her phone and began documenting everything. Tyler had just made his biggest mistake yet. He had escalated from intimidation to breaking and entering, and he had done it in a way that couldn't be explained away as teenage pranks. As she photographed the damage, Rebecca felt a calm certainty settle over her. The time for defensive responses was over. Tyler wanted to find out what happened when someone refused to be intimidated. He was about to get his answer. The break-in changed everything. Rebecca spent the early morning hours working with Dr. Holloway and campus security to process the crime scene. The investigation revealed that someone had used a crowbar to force open her classroom window, the same type of tool she had seen in Tyler's backpack weeks earlier. "This goes beyond school discipline," Dr. Holloway said as they reviewed the security footage from nearby cameras. "I'm calling the police." Detective Sarah Martinez arrived within an hour, a seasoned investigator who specialized in school-related incidents. She examined the classroom methodically, photographing the damage and collecting evidence. "The good news is that whoever did this wasn't very careful," Detective Martinez said as she dusted the window frame for fingerprints. "The bad news is that even if we identify the perpetrator, proving intent can be challenging with juvenile cases." Rebecca showed Detective Martinez her documentation from the past 3 weeks, the photographs, recordings, and detailed incident reports she had been maintaining. "This is impressive record keeping," the detective said, reviewing the files. "You've essentially built a case that shows escalating behavior leading up to last night's break-in. Will it be enough? If we can match fingerprints or find other physical evidence, absolutely. But even without that, this establishes a clear pattern of harassment that supports whatever charges we might file." By second period, news of the break-in had spread throughout Jefferson High. Students whispered in hallways, teachers exchanged worried glances, and there was a tension in the air that everyone could feel, but no one wanted to acknowledge directly. Tyler arrived at Rebecca's advanced English class with his usual swagger, but she noticed subtle signs of stress. His movements were slightly more rigid, his smile was forced, and his eyes kept darting toward the windows where evidence technicians had left traces of their investigation. "Heard you had some excitement over the weekend," Tyler said as he took his seat, loud enough for other students to hear. "Yes," Rebecca replied calmly. "Someone broke into the school and vandalized my classroom. The police are investigating it as a felony." The word felony had an immediate impact. Several students sat up straighter, and Tyler's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "That's terrible," Tyler said, though his tone suggested anything but genuine concern. "I hope they catch whoever did it." "I'm confident they will," Rebecca said, making direct eye contact with him. The perpetrator left quite a bit of evidence behind. As the class progressed, Rebecca noticed that Tyler seemed distracted. He made Fewer attempts to disrupt the lesson, and when he did speak, his comments lacked their usual calculated provocation. During lunch, Marcus Washington sought her out with urgent news. "Miss Chun, something's happening," Marcus said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Tyler's been in meetings with his parents and their lawyer all morning. And there are rumors that he's planning something big." "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly, but Jake Morrison was bragging to some kids that Tyler has a plan to end this whole situation once and for all." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Tyler was escalating again, but this time he seemed to be moving beyond his usual calculated intimidation tactics. That afternoon, she made an unprecedented decision. Instead of staying late to work in her classroom, she left immediately after the final bell and drove straight to Master Kim's academy. But instead of her usual training session, she asked for a private consultation. "I need to know what my legal rights are if someone physically attacks me at work," she said without preamble. Master Kim's expression grew serious. "You believe this is a possibility?" "I believe someone is running out of other options and might do something desperate." They spent the next hour discussing not just physical techniques, but legal principles. Master Kim had dealt with similar situations before, students who faced bullying or harassment that had escalated beyond verbal threats. "In Arizona," he explained, "you have the right to defend yourself if you reasonably believe you are in imminent danger of physical harm. But the key word is reasonable. You cannot escalate a situation unnecessarily." "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means you use only the force necessary to protect yourself. You don't continue fighting once the threat is neutralized. And you must be able to demonstrate that you tried to avoid the confrontation if possible." Angela Torres, who had been working out nearby, joined their conversation. "The most important thing," Angela said, "is situational awareness. Most attacks happen because the victim doesn't see them coming. If you stay alert and trust your instincts, you can usually avoid or minimize dangerous situations." That evening, Rebecca received an unexpected phone call from Samantha Rodriguez. "Ms. Chun," Samantha's voice was shaky but determined, "I heard about what happened to your classroom. I want to help." "Samantha, I appreciate that, but the best thing you can do is focus on your own safety and education." "No, you don't understand. I have information about Tyler and what he's planning." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. "What kind of information?" "My cousin goes to school with Tyler's younger brother. The brother was bragging that Tyler was going to teach the new teacher a lesson she'll never forget. He said it was going to happen tomorrow after school." "Did he say anything specific about what Tyler was planning?" "Just that he was going to make sure you never wanted to come back to Jefferson High, and that this time there wouldn't be any witnesses." After ending the call, Rebecca sat in her apartment considering her options. She could call the police, but without specific details about time, place, or method, there wasn't much they could do. She could report it to Dr. Holloway, but that would likely result in Tyler being questioned, which might just cause him to change his plans rather than abandon them. Or she could use herself as bait, ensuring that when Tyler made his move, she would be ready for him. The next day at Jefferson High felt like the calm before a storm. Tyler was absent from morning classes, which Rebecca found more concerning than reassuring. His friends Jake and Carlos were present, but seemed agitated and kept checking their phones constantly. During her planning period, Rebecca made final preparations. She informed Dr. Holloway that she planned to stay late to catch up on grading. But she didn't mention Samantha's warning. She positioned her phone to record automatically if triggered by sudden movement. And she changed into clothes that would allow for greater mobility, if necessary. As the final bell rang and students began filing out of the building, Rebecca felt the same focused calm she remembered from her competitive fighting days. Her breathing was controlled, her awareness was heightened, and her body was loose and ready. Around 5 o'clock, as the custodial staff was finishing their rounds in other parts of the building, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside her classroom. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving with deliberate quiet. The door opened without a knock, and Tyler walked in flanked by Jake and Carlos. But this time, their body language was different. There was no pretense of casual conversation or plausible deniability. They moved with the focused intent of people who had come to finish something. "Miss Chun," Tyler said, his voice carrying a menacing edge she had never heard before. "We need to have that conversation we've been putting off." Rebecca stood up from her desk, noting their positions, and the fact that Carlos had moved to block the door while Jake positioned himself near the windows. "Tyler," she said calmly, "I think you should reconsider whatever you're planning to do. There are security cameras in this hallway, and people know I'm here." Tyler's smile was cold and confident. "Actually, the camera on this end of the building has been malfunctioning all week, and everyone else has gone home. It's just us." As he spoke, Tyler pulled something from his jacket pocket, a can of spray paint that Rebecca recognized from the backpack she had seen weeks earlier. "Here's what's going to happen," Tyler continued. "You're going to resign from Jefferson High. You're going to withdraw your complaints about us. And you're going to make sure that no charges get filed over that little misunderstanding with your classroom. And if I don't agree to those terms?" Tyler's smile widened as Jake and Carlos closed in from either side. "Then we'll have to get creative about making sure you understand your situation." Rebecca shifted her weight slightly, moving into a balanced stance that might look casual to someone who didn't know what to look for. Her years of training had taught her to recognize the moment when words stopped being useful and action became necessary. "Tyler," she said quietly, "you've made a serious miscalculation." "Yeah? What's that?" Rebecca's expression hardened, and, for the first time since they had entered the room, Tyler's confidence wavered slightly. "You assumed I was someone who could be intimidated." The classroom fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Tyler's confident smirk faltered as he processed Rebecca's words, and for the first time in their confrontations, uncertainty crept into his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" Tyler asked, though his voice had lost some of its commanding edge. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved slowly toward the center of the classroom, her movements fluid and controlled. Jake and Carlos instinctively stepped back, their aggressive postures wavering as they sensed something different about their intended victim. "It means," Rebecca said quietly, "that you've spent weeks trying to intimidate someone without bothering to find out who you were really dealing with." Tyler attempted to regain control of the situation. "Listen, lady, you're outnumbered 3-1. Whatever tough girl act you think you're putting on, this isn't an act, Tyler." Rebecca's voice carried a calm certainty that cut through his bluster. She stood balanced on the balls of her feet, her hands relaxed at her sides, but every line of her body conveyed readiness. "Jake, Carlos," she continued without taking her eyes off Tyler, "you still have a chance to walk away from this. Whatever Tyler promised you, whatever he told you would happen here, I guarantee it's not going to go the way you think." Jake glanced nervously between Tyler and Rebecca, his earlier confidence evaporating. "Maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Jake." Tyler snapped. "She's trying to psych us out. It's 3 against 1. Numbers don't mean what you think they mean," Rebecca said. "Especially when the 3 people don't actually know how to fight." Tyler's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. He had built his reputation on the assumption that physical confrontation would never be necessary, that the threat of violence would always be enough to get what he wanted. "You want to find out?" Tyler said, pulling the spray paint can from his pocket and shaking it. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to decorate this classroom, and you're going to stand there and watch. Then you're going to clean it up while we explain exactly what's going to happen to your career if you don't do what we tell you." Rebecca's expression hardened. Tyler, I'm going to give you one last chance to reconsider this path. Turn around. Walk out that door, and we can still resolve this through proper channels. Or what? Or I stop treating you like students and start treating you like the criminals you've chosen to become. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Rebecca's posture shifted slightly, her breathing deepened, and an aura of controlled danger emanated from her small frame. Years of martial arts training had taught her to project calm before action, and Tyler was finally beginning to understand that he had severely miscalculated his opponent. Carlos, who had been positioned near the door, made the first move. He was the largest of the three and had clearly been designated as the muscle for their operation. He lunged toward Rebecca with the uncoordinated aggression of someone who had never faced real resistance. Rebecca's response was swift and precise. She sidestepped Carlos's charge, using his momentum against him as she guided him past her with a subtle redirection that sent him stumbling into a row of desks. The movement was so smooth it looked almost effortless, but Carlos crashed into the furniture with enough force to send desks sliding across the floor. Jake, seeing his friend go down, hesitated for a crucial moment. His hesitation gave Rebecca the opportunity to address Tyler directly. "Last chance," she said, her voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Tyler's response was to spray paint directly at Rebecca's face, a move that would have temporarily blinded her and given his group the advantage they needed. But Rebecca had been watching his body language and saw the attack coming. She ducked under the stream of paint and closed the distance between them in one fluid motion. What happened next lasted only seconds, but would be seared into the memory of everyone present. Rebecca's years of kickboxing training manifested in a combination of techniques that were both devastating and controlled. A quick jab to Tyler's solar plexus doubled him over, followed by a knee strike that sent him backward into the whiteboard. As Jake finally committed to joining the fight, Rebecca spun and delivered a perfect roundhouse kick to his midsection that lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into the bookshelf. Carlos had recovered from his initial stumble and charged again, this time with more focus and determination. Rebecca met his advance with a series of punches and kicks that demonstrated the difference between trained technique and raw aggression. Each strike was precisely placed to disable rather than permanently injure, but the cumulative effect was overwhelming. Within moments, Carlos was on the ground, gasping for breath and unable to continue. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 90 seconds. Tyler lay groaning against the wall. Jake was curled up among scattered books, and Carlos was struggling to catch his breath on the classroom floor. Rebecca stood in the center of the room, breathing heavily but otherwise unharmed. "Jake, Carlos," Rebecca said, her voice still controlled despite the physical exertion. "You're going to sit against that wall and not move until the police arrive. Tyler, you're going to stay exactly where you are." As if summoned by her words, the sound of running footsteps echoed in the hallway. The commotion had apparently been heard by someone still in the building, because Dr. Holloway appeared in the doorway flanked by 2 security guards. "What in God's name?" Dr. Holloway began, then stopped as she took in the scene. Rebecca calmly picked up her phone and showed that it had been recording the entire encounter. "These 3 students broke into my classroom, threatened me, and initiated physical violence. I defended myself using the minimum necessary force. Detective Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, followed by paramedics and additional police officers. The 3 boys were checked for injuries. Tyler had a bruised rib and some scrapes. Jake had the wind knocked out of him, but was otherwise fine. And Carlos had bruising but no serious damage. "Miss Chun," Detective Martinez said as crime scene technicians photographed the classroom. "Walk me through exactly what happened." Rebecca provided a detailed account while the video from her phone played on Detective Martinez's tablet. The recording clearly showed Tyler and his friends entering with aggressive intent, Tyler threatening her and spraying paint, and the subsequent physical confrontation that Rebecca had clearly not initiated. "The evidence is pretty clear-cut," Detective Martinez said. "You acted in self-defense against multiple assailants who had threatened you and initiated violence. The recording supports your account completely." Tyler, who had been sitting sullenly in handcuffs, finally spoke up. "This is insane. She attacked. She's supposed to be a teacher." "A teacher who was defending herself against criminal assault," Detective Martinez replied. "You broke into school property, threatened a staff member, and initiated physical violence. The fact that you chose the wrong target doesn't make you the victim." As the three boys were led away in handcuffs, Tyler made one final attempt to salvage his dignity. "This isn't over," he called back to Rebecca. "My family has lawyers. You'll pay for this." Detective Martinez paused in the doorway. "Actually, Tyler, your family's lawyers are going to be very busy. We matched your fingerprints to the break-in from earlier this week. You're looking at charges for burglary, criminal trespassing, assault, and making terroristic threats. Your friends are facing similar charges as accomplices." Over the following days, the story of what happened in room 237 spread throughout Jefferson High with the speed that only teenage gossip networks could achieve. But unlike the usual distorted rumors that characterize school communication, this story became more accurate with each telling, largely because Rebecca's phone recording had been shown to police and school administrators. The impact on the school's culture was immediate and profound. Students who had spent years walking in fear of Tyler and his crew suddenly found themselves in hallways where intimidation no longer held power. Samantha Rodriguez returned to school the following Monday with her head held high and submitted her essay to the regional writing competition. Marcus Washington approached Rebecca during lunch on Tuesday with an observation that made her smile. "Miss Chun, have you noticed how different things feel around here? It's like someone turned off a noise that we didn't even realize was bothering us." The faculty room conversations changed dramatically as well. Teachers who had learned to accommodate Tyler's intimidation tactics began discussing how to implement stronger classroom management policies. David Park, the chemistry teacher, summed up the collective feeling. "It's like we've been holding our breath for years and can finally exhale." Dr. Holloway called Rebecca to her office on Wednesday morning, but this time the principal's expression was one of genuine gratitude rather than concern. "I wanted to thank you," Dr. Holloway said, "and I wanted to officially inform you that the school board has reviewed the complaints filed against you. Given the evidence of what actually occurred, all charges have been dropped and formal apologies have been issued. What about Tyler and his friends? Tyler has been expelled permanently. Jake and Carlos are facing long-term suspensions and will be required to attend alternative education programs. The criminal charges are proceeding through the juvenile justice system." "And Mrs. Brennan's influence with the school board?" Dr. Holloway's smile was grim but satisfied. "Turns out that influence has limits when your son is facing felony charges, and there's video evidence of his behavior. The board has made it very clear that they support teachers who maintain safe learning environments." That evening at Master Kim's Academy, Rebecca found herself surrounded by fellow students who had heard about the incident through Angela Torres. The martial arts community was small and tight-knit, and news of a teacher successfully defending herself against multiple attackers had spread quickly. "You did exactly what you were trained to do," Master Kim said with obvious pride. "You avoided conflict when possible, used minimum necessary force when avoidance failed, and protected yourself without causing permanent harm to your attackers." "How do you feel about it?" Angela asked. "It's one thing to train for these situations, but actually having to use your skills can be emotionally complicated." Rebecca considered the question carefully. "I feel sad that it came to that point. I feel angry that those boys thought intimidation and violence were acceptable ways to solve problems. But I also feel proud that I was able to stand up for myself and, indirectly, for all the other people they've been terrorizing. Master Kim nodded approvingly. The warrior's path is not about seeking conflict. It is about being prepared when conflict seeks you. 2 weeks later, Rebecca stood in front of her advanced English class teaching a unit on heroism in literature. The classroom felt different now, not just because new security measures had been implemented, but because the atmosphere of fear that had permeated Jefferson High for years had been broken. Samantha Rodriguez raised her hand during a discussion of courage in Harper Lee's work. Miss Chun, do you think Atticus Finch would have been a more effective character if he had been able to physically defend himself and his family? It was a thoughtful question that demonstrated how much deeper their class discussions had become since the incident with Tyler. That's an interesting perspective, Samantha. What do you think? Is physical courage sometimes necessary to support moral courage? I think, Samantha said, her voice clear and confident, that sometimes bullies only understand one kind of language. And if good people don't speak that language when they have to, bad people get to control everything. Rebecca smiled, recognizing the insight of a student who had found her own voice and strength through witnessing someone else's courage. I think Harper Lee would have found that analysis very thoughtful, Rebecca replied. As the class period ended and students filed out, chattering about their homework assignment, Rebecca reflected on the changes that had occurred not just in her classroom, but throughout Jefferson High. Tyler's reign of intimidation had ended, not because administrators had finally found the courage to act, but because one person had refused to accept that fear was an inevitable part of the educational environment. The lesson plans on her desk outlined upcoming units on social justice, personal responsibility, and the power of individual action to create change. These weren't just abstract literary concepts anymore. They were principles that her students had seen demonstrated in real life. Rebecca packed up her materials and prepared to leave for her evening training session at Master Kim's academy. Not because she expected to face another Tyler Brennan, but because the discipline and confidence she had gained from martial arts training had proven valuable in ways that extended far beyond physical confrontation. As she walked through the hallways of Jefferson High, she noticed students moving with a different energy. Conversations were louder and more animated. Laughter came more easily. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the school for years had been replaced by something that felt like hope. The security cameras that now monitored every hallway would ensure that future Tyler Brennans would be caught before they could establish systems of intimidation. But more importantly, the students and staff of Jefferson High had learned that they didn't have to accept bullying as an inevitable part of their environment. Sometimes, Rebecca reflected as she pushed through the main doors into the Arizona sunshine, the most important lessons couldn't be found in textbooks. Sometimes the curriculum that mattered most was taught through example, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Tyler Brennan had taught Rebecca Chun an important lesson about the nature of institutional intimidation. But Rebecca had taught Tyler, his followers, and everyone else at Jefferson High an even more important lesson about the power of refusing to be a victim. The spray paint Tyler had used in his final, failed intimidation attempt had been cleaned from the classroom walls within hours. But the impact of what happened in room 237 would influence Jefferson High's culture for years to come. Because sometimes when someone finally stands up to a bully, it gives everyone else permission to stand up too. And sometimes, the best way to teach students about courage, justice, and personal responsibility is to demonstrate those qualities when they matter most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.